At 2:30 in the afternoon, on January 8, 1945, Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham crouched in knee-deep snow at the base of Hill 616 near Kaisersberg, France. Above him, German machine gun fire carved invisible lines through the winter air, pinning his entire platoon against the frozen ground. The temperature hovered around 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was the color of old steel. And Russell Dunham, 24 years old, with 3 campaigns already behind him, had absolutely no intention of dying that day. Behind him, 35 yards down the slope, the men of his platoon pressed themselves flat against the snow, unable to advance or retreat. The Germans held the high ground, 3 MG-42 machine gun positions dug into timber emplacements up the snow-covered slope. Each gun could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, that's 20 bullets per second, a rate of fire so devastating that American soldiers had nicknamed the weapon Hitler's buzzsaw for the continuous tearing sound it made. The Germans called it something else, Knochensäge, the bone saw. The situation was straightforward and lethal. If Dunham's platoon stayed pinned down, German artillery would bracket their position and obliterate them. If they tried to retreat across the open ground, the machine guns would cut them down before they made it 20 yards. The only option was forward, straight up a 40-degree slope into converging fields of fire, and nobody was surviving that approach. 11 men from their platoon had already been killed that week. The snow around their defensive positions was churned red. Every soldier in Company 1 knew the statistics by heart. In the Vosges Mountains campaign, the 3rd Infantry Division had suffered more casualties per day than any other American division in the European theater. The Germans owned that hill, and they weren't going to give it up without a fight. Russell Dunham looked at the slope, looked at his platoon trapped in the killing zone behind him, and made a decision that would change everything. The Forgotten Battle. To understand what happened on Hill 616, you need to understand where it happened and why it mattered. While the Battle of the Bulge consumed headlines and captured the world's attention in December 1944 and January 1945, another massive German offensive was unfolding 300 miles to the south in the Alsace-Lorraine region of France. Operation Nordwind, launched on New Year's Eve 1944, was the last major German offensive on the Western Front, and it's a battle most people have never heard of. The 3rd Infantry Division, Russell Dunham's unit, had been fighting continuously since landing in North Africa in November 1942. They'd stormed the beaches at Casablanca, fought through Sicily, survived the hell of Anzio, liberated Rome, and landed in southern France during Operation Dragoon in August 1944. By the time they reached the Vosges Mountains in January 1945, they'd been in combat for more than 500 consecutive days. They were exhausted, under strength, and facing some of the most brutal fighting conditions of the entire war. The Vosges Mountains in winter are unforgiving. Dense forests, steep slopes, narrow valleys perfect for ambush. When General Eisenhower pulled units north to counter the German offensive in the Ardennes, he left the U.S. 7th Army stretched dangerously thin across the Alsace front. The Germans saw the opportunity. 4 refitted infantry divisions, supported by panzer units, launched a coordinated attack designed to cut off American forces in northern Alsace and recapture Strasbourg. The weather was catastrophic. This was the coldest winter in 50 years. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero. Snow measured 2 feet deep in the valleys, deeper in the mountains. Foxholes filled with ice. Weapons froze. Men froze. The 3rd Infantry Division lost 863 men killed in December alone, with another 3,200 wounded. The replacement pipeline couldn't keep up with casualties. Platoons that should have numbered 40 men were operating with 20. Rifle companies at 60% strength were being pushed back into combat before their wounded had time to heal. The division's mission in early January was to help eliminate the Colmar Pocket, a German-held salient west of the Rhine that threatened the entire Allied advance. Kaisersberg sat at the northern approaches to Colmar, a medieval town nestled in the foothills where vine-covered slopes gave way to forested mountains. The Germans had fortified the high ground around the town with overlapping machine gun positions, creating a defensive network that turned every approach into a death trap. Hill 616 was one of those positions. Whoever controlled it controlled the valley approaches to Kaisersberg. And on January 8, 1945, the Germans weren't giving it up without a fight. The Kmustiger Fortress. The German defensive position on Hill 616 was textbook Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. 3 MG-42 machine gun emplacements positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire across the entire southern approach. Timber bunkers reinforced with logs and positioned to give maximum coverage with minimum exposure. Supporting riflemen dug into foxholes on the flanks, and the MG-42s themselves, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. The MG-42 was a revolutionary design, a general-purpose machine gun that could function as either a light machine gun with its bipod or a heavy sustained-fire weapon on a tripod. It fired the 7.92 mm Mauser cartridge, the same round used in the standard German rifle, which meant ammunition was interchangeable throughout the squad, but it was the rate of fire that made the weapon truly terrifying. 1,200 rounds per minute. Some variants pushed 1,500. That distinctive sound, like cloth tearing or a buzzsaw cutting through wood, came from the human inability to distinguish individual shots at that rate of fire. The noise itself became a psychological weapon. American soldiers who'd faced the MG-42 described it with a mixture of fear and respect. One veteran said it felt like the gun was trying to cut you in half. Another said the sound alone could freeze men in place, unable to move forward despite orders. The U.S. War Department actually produced a training film to combat the weapon's psychological effect, downplaying its lethality and assuring replacements that its bark is worse than its bite. Veterans of Omaha Beach would have called that line absurd. On Hill 616, the Germans had positioned their 3 MG-42s to create a killing zone that covered every approach. The first gun, on the left flank, commanded the lower slope and the tree line. The second, 50 yards uphill and to the right, covered the middle approaches and provided crossfire support. The third, 65 yards beyond that, and positioned highest on the slope, had clear sight lines over the entire American advance. Each position was crewed by 3 men, a gunner, an assistant gunner who fed the belt, and a spotter who scanned for targets. Supporting riflemen filled the gaps, ready to engage anyone who made it past the machine gun fire. The terrain amplified the defensive advantage. The slope rose at 40 degrees in places, steep enough to slow any assault to a crawl. The snow, 18 inches deep and frozen into a crusty surface that crunched with every step, made silent movement impossible. The temperature meant fingers went numb after minutes of exposure, making it difficult to work rifle bolts or throw grenades accurately. And the clear sight lines meant anyone moving up that slope would be visible from hundreds of yards away. Company I had walked into this killing box during their afternoon advance. The first burst of machine gun fire sent them diving for cover. Within minutes, they were pinned down completely, unable to move in any direction without drawing fire. That's when Russell Dunham made his move. One man, one choice. Russell Dunham was not a large man. He stood 5'9", weighed maybe 160 pounds, soaking wet. He'd enlisted in August 1940 with his older brother Ralph because jobs were scarce during the Depression and the Army paid $30 a month. He'd survived North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and now France without any particular desire to be a hero. But he understood the tactical reality facing his platoon with absolute clarity. If someone didn't take out those machine guns, everyone was going to die. He crawled back to the company position and found a white mattress cover. It wasn't proper winter camouflage, but it was better than the standard olive drab wool uniform that made him a dark target against the snow. He tore open the mattress cover and pulled it over his uniform like a robe. Then he started loading ammunition. He shoved 12 30-round magazines for his M1 carbine into every pocket and loop on his uniform. 360 rounds total. Then he started hanging Mark II fragmentation grenades on his belt, his suspenders, through the buttonholes of his field jacket. A dozen grenades, each weighing 1.5 pounds. When he stood up, he was carrying 72 pounds of ammunition and explosives on top of his rifle. His platoon sergeant looked at him but didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Everyone understood what Dunham was about to attempt, and everyone knew the odds. Dunham didn't explain his plan. He didn't give a speech or wait for orders. He simply started crawling up the hill. The first 75 yards took him 18 minutes. He moved during the brief moments when German fire shifted to other sectors of the American line. When the MG-42s swept back across his approach, he pressed himself flat against the snow and held his breath. The white mattress cover helped, but it wasn't perfect. Dark patches where the fabric bunched up made him visible to observers with good eyes. But the Germans were focused on the larger threat, the 35 men pinned down below, not on one lone figure inching up the slope. The snow soaked through the mattress cover almost immediately. His hands went numb. The rifle sling cut into his shoulder from the weight of all those grenades. Every yard gained felt like a mile, but he kept moving, crawling, pausing, crawling again. At 75 yards from the first machine gun emplacement, he stopped to gather himself. He was 10 yards from the timber bunker now. He could see the barrel of the MG-42 traversing back and forth, searching for targets. He could hear the Germans talking, their voices carrying in the cold air. This was the moment. Once he stood up and charged, there would be no going back. The Germans would see him immediately. He'd be in the open, exposed, moving uphill against a gun that could fire 20 bullets per second. But his platoon was trapped below, and the artillery barrage would start soon. Someone had to break the stalemate. Russell Dunham rose to his feet and charged, the first machine gun. The Germans spotted him immediately. The MG-42 swung toward him, the barrel tracking his movement. At 6 yards, the gun opened fire. Rounds tore through the white mattress cover, pulling at the fabric. Then, something hit him in the back with the force of a sledgehammer. A rifle bullet, fired from one of the supporting positions, carved a 10-inch gash across his back from his left shoulder blade toward his spine. The impact spun him completely around and threw him 15 yards back down the hill. He landed face down in the snow. Blood poured from the wound, soaking through the mattress cover and staining the white fabric bright red. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a tearing sensation that made it difficult to breathe. For 5 seconds, he didn't move. Then he heard something land in the snow 2 feet from his head. A German egg grenade, the distinctive potato masher shape unmistakable. The fuse was already burning. Dunham kicked it away with his boot. The grenade exploded 5 yards down the slope, close enough that the concussion lifted him off the ground, close enough that shrapnel peppered the snow around him, close enough that his ears rang and his vision blurred. And Russell Dunham got back on his feet. He came up the hill firing. His M1 carbine was still loaded with 28 rounds. The German machine gunner was trying to swing the MG-42 back toward him, but Dunham was already inside the gun's minimum traverse arc, too close for the barrel to depress low enough. At 4 yards, he fired a 3-round burst into the gunner's chest. The assistant gunner reached for his rifle. Dunham shot him twice. Both Germans dropped. The third crew member, the ammunition feeder, threw his hands up and started shouting in German. Dunham's carbine was empty, 30 rounds expended in less than 20 seconds. He slung the rifle, grabbed the German by the collar of his field gray coat, and hauled him out of the timber emplacement. Then he shoved him down the hill toward the American lines. The German half ran, half fell through the snow. Dunham's platoon would take him for interrogation. Blood was running down Dunham's back in steady streams now. The bullet wound had torn through muscle and tissue, but missed his spine by less than 2 inches. Every movement pulled the gash wider. The white mattress cover was soaked red from his shoulders to his waist. Against the snow, he looked like a red flag. But the first machine gun was silenced. 1 down, 2 to go. The second machine gun position was 50 yards uphill and to the right. The Germans manning that gun had watched Dunham take out the first nest. They knew he was coming. They'd adjusted their field of fire to cover his most likely approach. When Dunham started moving, they opened fire at 40 yards. The second assault rounds snapped past his head and kicked up geysers of snow around his boots. Dunham went down and crawled. The pain in his back was so intense he had to stop every few yards to keep from blacking out. Blood pooled inside his uniform, warm against his frozen skin. His hands were shaking from blood loss and cold, but he kept crawling, pulling himself forward through the snow, each movement a deliberate act of will. At 25 yards from the second emplacement, he rose to one knee and pulled 2 Mark II grenades from his belt. The fragmentation grenades were simple but effective, a serrated cast iron body filled with TNT designed to fragment into deadly shrapnel on detonation. He yanked both pins, counted 2 seconds to let the fuses burn down, and hurled them in a high arc toward the timber bunker. The Germans saw them coming. One of them screamed. Both grenades detonated inside the emplacement within half a second of each other. The combined blast was massive, throwing logs and equipment out of the position. Smoke poured from the shattered bunker. When it cleared, the machine gun was silent. All 3 crew members were dead. But Dunham wasn't finished. 6 German riflemen had been dug into foxholes around the machine gun position, providing supporting fire. They were scrambling out of their holes now, trying to get clear of the American advance. Dunham moved forward with his carbine raised. He'd reloaded during the crawl, shoving a fresh 30-round magazine into the weapon. At 15 yards, he opened fire. He went through the entire magazine, shooting at every shape that moved. He hit 3 of the Germans. The others broke and ran up the hill away from the American assault. Dunham let them go. He had 1 target left, and it was the most dangerous position of all. The 3rd machine gun was 65 yards further up the slope. It was the highest position, the one with the best field of fire over the entire American advance. The Germans there had been watching Dunham's assault for the last 12 minutes. They knew exactly where he was. They knew he was wounded. They knew his white coat was now blood red and visible against the snow from 200 yards away. And they had him in their sights. Rifle grenades started exploding in the snow 10 yards from his position. The concussions knocked him sideways. He hit the ground as machine gun fire tore through the air where he'd been standing. He was out in the open now, no cover, no concealment. The blood trail behind him in the snow looked like a road pointing directly to his position, and the Germans on top of the hill weren't going to miss again. The final machine gun Dunham crawled. The 3rd machine gun position was dug into a cluster of timber 40 yards ahead and 30 feet higher in elevation. The Germans had reinforced it with sandbags and positioned it to cover the entire southern approach to Hill 616. It was the key to the whole defensive network. Take it out, and the hill fell. Fail, and everyone died. Every few seconds, the MG-42 would fire a burst, walking rounds across the snow, searching for him. He moved during the gaps between bursts. 5 yards, stop. Wait for the gun to traverse. 3 more yards, stop. The snow was so cold it burned his hands. The wound in his back had gone from sharp pain to a deep grinding ache that radiated through his entire torso. His vision was starting to tunnel at the edges from blood loss, but he still had 9 magazines and 8 grenades. That would have to be enough. At 40 yards from the 3rd position, a rifle grenade exploded 6 yards to his left. The blast threw snow and frozen dirt across his back. The impact felt like being kicked by a horse. He didn't know if he'd been hit again with shrapnel. He couldn't tell anymore. Everything hurt. He kept crawling. 30 yards, 25. The machine gun fire was getting more accurate. The Germans could see him now, even against the snow. The blood had soaked through the entire mattress cover. He was leaving a red trail that pointed directly to his position like an arrow. 20 yards, 15. At 15 yards, Dunham stopped crawling and gathered his legs under him. He had to time this perfectly. The MG-42 fired in bursts of 8 to 12 rounds, then paused for 2 to 3 seconds while the gunner readjusted his aim. Dunham counted. Burst. 1, 2, 3. He lunged to his feet and staggered forward. The Germans saw him immediately. The machine gunner swung the barrel toward him, but Dunham was already moving, already pulling grenades from his belt. He had 2 Mark IIs in his hands, pins pulled. At 10 yards, he threw them both. The first grenade hit the sandbags and bounced into the emplacement. The second went through the narrow firing slit. Dunham dove flat as both grenades detonated. The blast was massive. Sandbags flew apart. Timber logs cracked and splintered. The machine gun barrel was blown sideways off its mount. Smoke poured from the shattered position. Dunham pushed himself up and moved forward with his carbine raised, scanning for movement. All 3 crew members were down. One was still moving, trying to reach for a rifle. Dunham shot him once. The German stopped moving. Then he heard boots crunching in snow behind him. Dunham spun around. A German rifleman had come up from one of the support foxholes, maybe 20 feet away. The German raised his carabiner .98 rifle and fired at point-blank range. The bullet missed Dunham's head by 3 inches. Dunham fired back. His first round hit the German in the throat. His second hit center mass. The German fell backward into the snow and didn't move. Russell Dunham stood on the hilltop breathing hard. His carbine was empty again. He'd fired 175 rounds. He'd thrown 11 grenades. 3 machine gun positions were destroyed. 9 Germans were dead. 7 more were wounded. 2 had been taken prisoner, and his platoon was no longer pinned down. Below him, Company Y was advancing up the slope. His brother Ralph was among them, moving with the second squad. The Germans were falling back to secondary positions further up the ridge. The attack was succeeding. Hill 616 would be in American hands by nightfall. Dunham looked down at his uniform. The white mattress cover was completely red now, saturated with blood from the neck down to his knees. He could feel the wound in his back pulling apart with every breath. The pain was so intense he couldn't think straight. His hands were shaking uncontrollably from shock and blood loss. But he'd done it. 120 soldiers from Company I had been pinned in that valley. Without his assault, they would have been slaughtered by artillery within the hour. Now they were moving. Now they were fighting. Now they had a chance. Russell Dunham sat down in the snow and waited for the medics to reach him. He didn't think he was going to die. Not today. Captured. The medics reached Dunham 8 minutes after he sat down on the hilltop. They cut away the blood-soaked mattress cover and opened his field jacket to assess the wound. The bullet had carved a gash 10 inches long and 2 inches deep across his back, running from his left shoulder blade down toward his spine. They could see muscle tissue and exposed bone. They packed the wound with sulfa powder, wrapped it with compression bandages, gave him a shot of morphine, and tagged him for evacuation. Dunham refused to leave. He walked back down the hill with Company Y, carrying his empty carbine. By the time they reached the battalion aid station at 6 in the evening, he'd lost enough blood that he collapsed at the entrance. The battalion surgeon examined him and immediately ordered him to the rear for surgery. The wound needed stitches, debridement, and at least 2 weeks of recovery before he could return to combat operations. Dunham spent 4 days at the division clearing station. The surgeons cleaned the wound and closed it with 43 stitches. They told him the bullet had missed his spinal cord by less than 2 inches. If the angle had been slightly different, he would have been paralyzed from the waist down. But the wound was clean. No major nerve damage, no infection. He would heal. On January 13th, 5 days after the assault on Hill 616, Dunham was released from the clearing station and sent to a rest area 20 miles behind the front lines. The doctors told him he needed 3 more weeks of recovery before returning to duty. The stitches were still in. The wound was still seeping through the bandages. But on January 18th, 10 days after Hill 616, he walked into the Company I command post and reported for duty. His wound wasn't healed. The stitches were still in place, but 2nd Platoon was down to 18 men, and they needed every rifle they could get. The company commander looked at Dunham's medical file, looked at Dunham, and assigned him back to his squad. No questions asked. They were moving north to Holzwihr, a small town 15 miles from the German border. Intelligence reported heavy German armor in the area. Company I would be holding a defensive position on the southern edge of town. Dunham rejoined his platoon on January 20th. His brother Ralph was still with the 2nd Squad. They didn't talk about Hill 616. Everyone in the company knew what had happened. General Patch himself had visited the battalion on January 16th to meet Dunham. The general had shaken his hand and said his actions had saved the lives of 120 men who would have been killed by artillery if the machine guns hadn't been eliminated. But that was Hill 616. This was Holzwihr. Different fight, different stakes. And on the morning of January 22, 1945, 2nd Platoon would find itself surrounded by German tanks with nowhere to run. The sauerkraut barrel. At 6 in the morning on January 22, 1945, German tanks appeared on 3 sides of Company Lorhorn's position in Holzwihr. Dunham counted 7 Panther tanks and 3 Tigers moving through the morning fog. The 3rd Infantry Division had no armor support in this sector, no tank destroyers, no artillery within range. 2nd Platoon had 2 bazooka teams and exactly 14 rockets between them. The German attack came from the 19th Army's Armored Reserve units, part of their final push during Operation Nordwind. The Panthers came in from the west, advancing in a staggered line across the open farmland. The Tigers moved up from the south, their 88mm guns already traversing to engage targets. Company I's position was indefensible. They held a cluster of farm buildings with no cover, no concealment, and no way to stop 70-ton tanks with frontal armor 8 inches thick. The bazooka teams fired their rockets at maximum range. 2 hit. Both bounced off the Panthers' glacis plates without penetrating. The Germans didn't even slow down. At 6:30, the company commander gave the order to surrender. White flags went up from 3 buildings. The German tanks stopped advancing, and infantry moved forward to take prisoners. 147 men from Company the Fun walked out with their hands up. The Germans disarmed them, searched them, and formed them into columns for transport to prisoner of war camps in the rear. Russell Dunham didn't surrender. He slipped out the back of the farmhouse while the Germans were processing prisoners and ran west through a line of bare trees toward a cluster of outbuildings 200 yards away. His back wound had reopened during the night. He could feel blood seeping through the bandages under his uniform. But he wasn't going to spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. He reached the outbuildings without being spotted. There were 3 structures, a small barn, a tool shed, and a stone storage building with a wooden door hanging off its hinges. The barn was empty except for rotting hay. The shed had nothing but broken farm equipment. The storage building had barrels. 6 wooden barrels stood against the far wall, each one about 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. Dunham lifted the lid off the first barrel. Potatoes, frozen solid. Second barrel, empty. Third barrel, sauerkraut. The fermented cabbage filled the barrel to within 6 inches of the top. The smell hit him like a physical force, overwhelming and acidic, strong enough to water his eyes. Dunham looked back toward the farmhouse. German soldiers were moving through the area now, checking buildings, searching for stragglers. He could hear voices shouting in German, boots crunching on frozen ground. They'd be at the storage building in minutes. He climbed into the sauerkraut barrel. The cabbage was cold and slimy and packed tight enough that he had to force his way down into it. He sank up to his chest, then his neck, then pulled the wooden lid over his head and settled into the fermented mass. The smell was suffocating. The brine soaked through his uniform and into the open wound on his back. The sting was excruciating, like acid poured directly into raw tissue. He bit down on his tongue to keep from screaming. He could hear the Germans entering the storage building, boots on stone floor, voices discussing something in rapid German, the sound of barrels being kicked, lids being lifted. They were checking every container. Dunham held his breath and pressed himself deeper into the sauerkraut. The lid above him stayed closed. The Germans moved through the building, checked the other barrels, and left. Dunham stayed in the barrel. He didn't move. He barely breathed. The temperature was dropping. Night was coming, and he had no idea if the Germans would be back. He spent 13 hours in that sauerkraut barrel. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset. The brine froze into slush around his body. He couldn't feel his hands or feet. The wound on his back had gone numb from the cold and the acidic burn of the fermented cabbage. At 7 in the morning on January 23rd, the sun came up. Dunham could see thin strips of light through gaps in the wooden barrel lid. He listened. No voices, no engine noise, no boots on frozen ground. The Germans had moved on. He waited another 30 minutes to be certain, then slowly pushed the lid off and climbed out of the barrel. His uniform was soaked through with sauerkraut brine and frozen stiff. His fingers were white from frostbite. The bandages on his back had dissolved completely, leaving the wound exposed. He could smell the sauerkraut on himself from 10 feet away, but he was alive and he was free. The long walk home. He moved to the door of the storage building and looked out. The farmyard was empty. The German tanks had pulled back during the night. Company Ott's position was abandoned, except for equipment the Germans hadn't bothered to collect. Dunham could see American helmets and rifles scattered in the dirt. He needed to move. He needed to get back to American lines before the Germans returned. But first, he needed to urinate. 13 hours in a barrel without moving had left him in agony. He stepped out of the storage building, moved around the corner to the side of the barn, and relieved himself against the stone wall. That's when the 2 German soldiers appeared. They came around the opposite corner of the barn at a walking pace, talking to each other in low voices. They saw Dunham immediately. Both raised their rifles and started shouting in German. Dunham raised his hands. He had no weapon visible. His carbine was still in the sauerkraut barrel. He was soaking wet, covered in fermented cabbage, and obviously unarmed. The Germans approached carefully. The first soldier kept his rifle trained on Dunham, while the second moved forward to search him. The German patted down his field jacket, checking pockets. He found a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes in Dunham's left breast pocket and held them up. The other German immediately lowered his rifle and reached for the cigarettes. Both soldiers started arguing. The first one who'd found them claimed ownership. The second one said they should split them. They argued for 30 seconds, both focused entirely on the cigarettes. Neither one finished searching Dunham. Neither one checked his right side. Neither one noticed the Colt M1911 pistol in a leather shoulder holster tucked under his right arm beneath his field jacket. The Germans finally agreed to share the cigarettes, split the pack, and gestured for Dunham to start walking. They marched him back to the main road, where a German Kübelwagen sat idling, its driver waiting behind the wheel. The two soldiers pushed Dunham into the back seat and climbed in on either side of him. The driver put the vehicle in gear and headed east toward German lines. They drove for 40 minutes through frozen farmland and small villages. At 11 in the morning, the driver pulled off the main road and stopped in front of a stone chateau that had been converted into a German command post. The driver said something in German and climbed out of the vehicle. He walked toward the chateau entrance and disappeared inside, leaving the engine running. The guard on Dunham's left lit one of the Lucky Strikes and stared out the window. The guard on his right leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. Neither one was watching Dunham anymore. He reached under his jacket, pulled the Colt from its holster, turned to his right and shot the guard in the head at point-blank range. The guard on his left started to turn. Dunham shot him twice in the chest. Then he kicked open the door, jumped out of the Kübelwagen, and ran for the tree line 300 yards to the north. Behind him, he heard shouting from the chateau, then gunfire. Bullets snapped past his head and kicked up frozen dirt at his feet. He didn't look back. He reached the tree line and kept running, crashing through bare branches and frozen underbrush. The Germans fired for another 30 seconds, then stopped. They weren't pursuing. They had prisoners to guard and a command post to secure. One escaped American wasn't worth a squad-level manhunt, but Dunham was alone in German-held territory with no map, no compass, no food, and a pistol with 4 rounds remaining. The wound on his back had reopened during the run. His feet were already numb from frostbite after 13 hours in the sauerkraut barrel. The temperature was 9 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. He was 30 miles behind enemy lines with no clear route back to American positions. He moved west. That was the only direction that made sense. West toward the front. West toward the sound of artillery. West toward anything that wasn't German. He walked through the afternoon, staying in tree lines and ditches, avoiding roads and villages. Every 20 minutes he had to stop and force his frozen feet to keep moving. The pain in his back was constant now, a grinding ache that radiated through his entire torso with every step. At nightfall, he found a destroyed barn and crawled into what remained of the hayloft. He couldn't risk a fire. The Germans had patrols everywhere. He pulled dried hay over himself for insulation and tried to sleep. The temperature dropped to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. His uniform was still damp from the sauerkraut brine. The moisture froze solid against his skin. He shivered so violently that his teeth cracked together and cut his tongue. On the second day, he kept moving west. He crossed frozen fields and empty roads. He saw German vehicles twice and hid both times until they passed. His feet had gone from numb to burning agony. When he pulled off his boots that night to check them, he saw that his toes had turned black. 2nd-degree frostbite, possibly 3rd. He put his boots back on and kept walking. If he stopped moving, he would freeze to death. On the 3rd day, January 25th, he heard American artillery. The sound came from the west, a steady rumble of 155mm howitzers firing in battery. He followed the sound. By mid-afternoon, he could see smoke from American positions rising above the tree line. He was close, maybe 5 miles, maybe less. At 4 in the afternoon, Dunham emerged from a stand of trees and saw the Ill River. A steel bridge crossed the water, and on the far side, American engineers were working to reinforce the structure with timber supports. Dunham started walking toward them. The engineers saw him coming and raised their rifles. He was wearing a German-issue field jacket he'd taken from a destroyed supply truck the previous day. He looked like the enemy. Dunham raised his hands and shouted that he was American. The engineers kept their rifles trained on him. He shouted his name, his rank, his unit. One of the engineers lowered his weapon and waved him forward. Dunham crossed the bridge, barely able to walk now. His feet were destroyed. His back was infected. He'd lost 20 pounds in 3 days. He collapsed at the far end of the bridge. A medic appeared. Corporal Henderson from the battalion aid station. Henderson looked at Dunham's feet, looked at the wound on his back, and immediately called for a stretcher. They loaded Dunham onto a truck and drove him to the division clearing station. The surgeons there worked for 6 hours to save his feet from amputation. They cleaned the infected wound on his back and started him on sulfa drugs to fight the infection. 3 days later, while Dunham was recovering in a hospital bed, a lieutenant from division headquarters walked into the ward and told him that his company commander had submitted a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross, but the regimental commander had changed it, and the division commander had approved it. Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham was being awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on Hill 616, the Medal and the Man. On April 23, 1945, Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham stood at attention in Zeppelin Stadium in Nuremberg, Germany. The stadium had been the site of Nazi party rallies before the war. Now it was rubble and broken concrete, occupied by American forces. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commander of the 7th Army, stood before him, holding the Medal of Honor. Patch read the citation aloud. The crawl uphill 616, the 3 machine gun nests, the 10-inch wound, the German grenade kicked aside, 9 enemies killed, 7 wounded, 2 captured, 175 rounds of carbine ammunition, 11 grenades expended, and 120 American soldiers saved from certain death. Then, Patch placed the medal around Dunham's neck and said something that wasn't in the official citation. He said that in 30 years of military service, he had never seen a single soldier turn the tide of an entire engagement through sheer courage and refusal to stop. He said that Russell Dunham had fought like 10 men that day, and every man who walked off Hill 616 alive owed his life to one sergeant with a mattress cover and a dozen grenades. Dunham stood silent. His brother Ralph was in the audience, along with 40 men from Company 1 who had survived the Alsace campaign. The war in Europe would end in 2 weeks. The 3rd Infantry Division had fought from North Africa to Sicily to Italy to France to Germany. They had lost more than 11,000 men killed and wounded. They had earned 36 Medals of Honor, more than any other division in the war. The medics had saved Dunham's feet. The infection in his back wound had cleared after 3 weeks of sulfa treatment. The stitches had come out. The wound had healed into a thick scar that ran 10 inches across his spine. He would carry shrapnel in his back for the rest of his life, small fragments too deep to remove without risking paralysis. After the war, Russell Dunham returned to the United States. He was 25 years old. He had enlisted in August 1940 with his brother Ralph because work was scarce during the Depression and the Army paid $30 a month. He had survived 4 amphibious landings, 7 major campaigns, and 2 escape attempts from German capture. He had killed at least 19 enemy soldiers that could be confirmed. He had been wounded 3 times. He went home to Illinois. He married a woman named Wilda and settled on a small farm near Jerseyville. He worked as a benefits counselor for the Veterans Administration in St. Louis for 32 years, helping returning veterans navigate the system, file claims, access medical care. He attended Medal of Honor conventions and reunions with the 3rd Infantry Division. He erected a monument at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in honor of those who served with the division. The monument was dedicated on May 20th, 2000. He never talked much about the war unless someone asked directly. And when they did, he always said the same thing. He said he was just doing his job. He said, any man in Company 1 would have done the same. His brother Ralph died in 1999. Most of the men from Company 1 were gone. Russell Dunham died in his sleep on April 6, 2009, at his home in Godfrey, Illinois. He was 89 years old. The war that had consumed his youth was now ancient history to most Americans. But the Medal of Honor citation remained, the official record remained. And 120 men who should have died on Hill 616 in January 1945 had lived instead. Remembering the forgotten. There's something about Russell Dunham's story that cuts through the decades and lands with weight in the present moment. It's not just the raw courage of charging uphill into machine gun fire. It's not just the absurdity of hiding in a sauerkraut barrel for 13 hours. It's not even the escape, the long walk through frozen territory, the sheer stubborn refusal to give up when every logical calculation said he should. It's the ordinariness of the man himself. Russell Dunham wasn't a professional soldier looking for glory. He was a kid from Illinois who joined the Army because jobs were scarce, and $30 a month looked good during the Depression. He survived campaign after campaign, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he wanted to go home. And on January 8, 1945, when his platoon was pinned down and dying, he made a choice that most of us would like to think we'd make, but can never really know until we're there. The 3rd Infantry Division fought in every major campaign in the European theater. They suffered more casualties than any other American division. They earned more medals of honor than any other division. And most people have never heard of Operation Nordwind, the battle where Russell Dunham earned his medal. It's been overshadowed by the Battle of the Bulge, relegated to a footnote in history books, forgotten by everyone except the men who fought there and the families who remember them. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they are extraordinary, though they are, but because they are ordinary. Because they remind us that the great sweeping movements of history are built from 10,000 small acts of courage by people who never expected to be remembered. Russell Dunham crawled up Hill 616 because someone had to. He destroyed 3 machine gun nests because that's what the situation required. He survived a sauerkraut barrel and walked 30 miles through enemy territory because the alternative was dying in a prisoner of war camp, and he'd come too far to give up then. After the war, he went home. He worked a regular job. He helped other veterans navigate the bureaucracy he'd learned to navigate himself. He attended reunions and told his story when people asked, but he never claimed to be special. He was just a soldier who did his job. And 120 men got to go home because of it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every single like tells the algorithm to show this to more people, and stories like Russell Dunham's deserve to be told. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Real people, real heroism, real history that matters. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the world, and you're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Russell Dunham doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.